All right. So hi everyone. My name is Aaron Giles. Does anybody know what MAME is?
No, what's that?
Okay. So
it's what we do to people who don't know.
Ken asked me to come and talk because he recognized that this project has been going on for a long time, and there are some people on the project who just don't stop working on it, and I'm one of them. And so kind of wanted to know why and what makes us tick. So I put together a little something. We'll see how it goes. I've never done this kind of thing before. So where I work, if your presentation looks fancy and has animations, then you're not an engineer. But I'm an engineer, so my presentation will look like that. It's a point of pride. So, just in case somebody didn't know what MAME was, it's this emulator thing that we work on. So really the thing is, the goal of MAME at the highest level, what it does is it takes arcade hardware and writes computer software that behaves the same way. The idea is that you use the original media, the original ROMs and disks and various other media that are used to contain programs and graphics and sound, and you read those in this computer program and simulate all the chips, all the behaviors, all the internals of what was going on in that arcade cabinet. And one thing that's important to know about MAME is that it's developer-focused. That is, it's not very user-friendly. I mean, it's got menus, but they're not like nice menus. It doesn't really like to use the mouse. It's keyboardy. So, you know, a lot of the complaints that I hear about MAME is it's hard to use. I don't understand how to do it, and it's kind of intentionally that way. In part because our goal is really to make it easy to understand how the hardware works, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. There's really two projects in MAME. There's one which is figure out how all this hardware worked. So we've got 30 years of arcade games covering a large amount of history, and there's a lot of cool stuff in them. And we want to figure out how it works because we're just that kind of people. And that's really our first motivation. We're the kind of people who like to go in and figure out how things work. Then there's recently, I'd say within the last 5 or 6 years, it's kind of also become a project to design a software architecture for emulation. So we're not the only people who like to emulate stuff. I mean, and not even just games. So you look at games, you think, okay, games, arcade games, great. And you know, console emulators, I'm sure all you guys know about that kind of stuff. But, you know, Library of Congress is starting to look into how to preserve old documents, you know, from the VisiCalc documents and old, Word 1.0 documents. Now, there are two ways you can do that. One is you can keep converting them to newer and newer formats, but every time you do that, you lose something. Conversion is never perfect. The alternative is you run an emulator and you load the original document into the original program running on the emulator. And if you do your emulator right, in theory, you haven't lost anything. You still have the original in its original form. And so it goes beyond that. There are people who rely on emulation. You look at companies like Apple, they've done emulation for a number of years. They transitioned across 3 processor architectures and kept a whole lot of stuff going. That's all due to emulation. So it's a broader thing, and MAME, as a result, arcade hardware is incredibly diverse. That's the happy thing about it. Arcade hardware is incredibly diverse, and when you look at the collection of arcade hardware, you're like, wow, we really have emulated practically every CPU, every sound chip invented in the last 30 years. Why not make that a little easier to assemble into something that can be used more broadly? So my goal has been to try and take something that was originally not designed to be super flexible, and it was originally designed to be a little 8-bit emulator running Pac-Man or something. It's become this thing that'll run everything from 8-bit CPUs to 64-bit CPUs. That'll run all kinds of stuff down to 3D hardware and simple hardware. It's just this very broad thing. And so this is sort of something I push for, because I'm a software engineer. And as a software engineer, a good architecture, a good software architecture appeals to me. But we're starting with something that maybe it wasn't super well designed to do what it does today. And so we want to kind of take it into that and build a good software architecture out of it. So quick project history, for those who don't know. It started in 97, so that's 11 and a half years. First version was released in early 97. Originally written for DOS, because DOS was the rage back then. But we switched to Windows in 2001. But we've really always been cross-platform. So the whole architecture is designed to be cross-platform. It's designed to be ported. It's gotten better over time, in my opinion. And so if you're on Linux or anything else running SDL MAME is for you. There's this old thing called XMAME. It still gets a lot of press because everybody heard of XMAME back in the day, but it's like 3+ years out of date and don't use it. I mean, unless you like 3-year-old software. And then there's MAME OS X for Mac OS 10. It's a little optimized for Mac OS 10. It's got a nice UI. Not Mac MAME, which is where I started. I started on Mac MAME. I was a Mac guy for a number of years. And that's also dead. I'm okay with that. There's been over 100 contributors. So this project is huge. It's grown way out of control. There's hundreds of people who have contributed to it in terms of reverse engineering, in terms of providing knowledge about how these games work, in terms of providing access to games that we've never even heard of before. So there's just a lot of great people who have worked on this. So, I'm currently coordinating the project, but I'm by no means like the guy. So there's lots of other guys out there who deserve, praise or for what they've done there. And our source code has been available from the beginning. And I don't say we're open source because we're not open source, but we're source code available. And for those who want to know the distinction about that, we can talk about that later. So I really want to talk about why is MAME important. This is why it's important to me. And the way I look at MAME is to arcade games as the Library of Congress is to books. Now that may be overstating it a bit, but that's how I like to look at it in my idealized world. So really the thing is, you could say it's really up to the game publishers to ensure that their stuff lives on. But do you really want to leave it up to a bunch of companies that most of them are dead and they're not very good at keeping archives and they're not really objective about what is worth keeping and what's not worth keeping? The Library of Congress kind of serves that role when you look at it. They keep a whole bunch of stuff. They have people who are experts and understand that, and they don't really care what the book publishers want them to keep. They keep what they feel is important, culturally important. So I worked at a game company that actually had good archives, and I still couldn't get stuff out of the archives 10 years after we put it in there. It was nearly impossible. So from my personal experience, I do not believe that game companies as a whole are very good at keeping their own archives. In fact, if you look at almost any emulator that's commercially sent today, if you really kind of dig into it and poke into it a little bit, you'll often find README files that are shipped with ROMs that people have dumped for emulation in MAME, because it's a lot easier for them to go out and get the stuff there than to try and find it in their own archives. And I get at least a couple of calls a year from some guy whose task is to emulate some old game saying, how did this really work? Because even though the companies have indirectly licensed with those guys and talked to them, they didn't actually get real information about how these things work. And so by all the evidence I see, I think it's really important for somebody else to be doing this work. And it's not really in the company's best interest. They want to exploit the stuff that's popular. But to my opinion, for every Pac-Man, there's a hopping Mappy or some other game that you've never heard of before. I know these companies produce tons of games, and a fraction of them were popular. I don't really care. I want to understand all of them, because there's probably a lot of really cool games I never even heard of before, and I know that for a fact. In 11 years, I've found so many really neat games. And a commercial emulator must focus on usability over accuracy. So from my opinion, I don't really care if MAME runs a game slowly on the current hardware. Sorry, but I don't. If we do it right, I'd rather do it right and get it right, and then if it's slow, it's slow, and it'll get better because hardware gets better. We'll find better ways of doing things. I have faith in that. However, if you paid for an emulator from a company, you're going to be pissed off if that thing doesn't run well on your system. And so it's in their best interest to cut corners to make things run on lower end systems. And to my mind, that's fine. That's fine. I feel that there's two different areas here. There's people who make commercial emulators, and they have a challenging job. And then there's people like us who have the luxury of saying, we don't care about performance. We want to do our best to get it right. So, what are the real goals of MAME? This is my view on the goals of MAME. Now, there's 100 people who work on this project. We haven't officially stated all our goals, so they probably disagree with me, but this is from my perspective. Number one is we want to document the hardware. Now, a lot of people say, where's your document? You just write a bunch of source code. And yes, that's true. One thing I've learned is that keeping documentation in sync with source code is nearly impossible. The best proof that your documentation is right is, does this code work? So you can argue that we can spend a lot of time trying to write a document to say, here's how this stuff works. Or you can say, yeah, it's in the source code. It may not be the most user-friendly way of getting at it, but if we do a good job, if we architect the software system well enough to describe the hardware in a way that is somewhat understandable, then I think we've done a good job. And so that's partly why I think it's good to have a good architecture, a software architecture, and that appeals to software engineering. Another goal that I feel MAME has is it provides a database of known good parts. So inside this giant program is the CRC and SHA-1 hashes of, 6,000 plus known good ROM dumps and things like that. And there's actually tools in MAME where you have a board, you don't know what that board is. You say, God, I got this board from some junk pile. I don't know what it is. You dump one ROM from that, you run MAME ROM ident on it, and it'll tell you every match that it finds in the database. And that's really useful. That's very useful stuff. And this known good stuff, we know it's good because we boot it, it passes all the internal checks, the game runs. We're pretty confident that it's good. Now, it's not 100% perfect, but we try our best. The third goal is, as I said, I want to provide a universal emulation platform. And this is kind of my goal. I don't know that everybody on the team agrees with me on this, but I'm coordinating it, so I get to say that. Number 4 goal is we want to enable analysis of arcade hardware and software. I mean, we just saw the thing about Donkey Kong 2. That's really cool. And I'm super psyched to hear that he was using MAME to help debug that and work that. It's unfortunate that it didn't work exactly on the software as it did on the hardware. I'd really like that to be the case. But I think a lot of the emulation that we started with was, the goal was just to get it up and running. And there's a big difference between getting it up and running and dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and getting it working, getting everything to work. And I'd like to get there. And I've been pushing people to get there. And there's subtle things. Like, did you know that most games don't actually run at 60 hertz? They run at 56.7789 hertz or 58.92 hertz. I mean, every game, hardware, platform, has different video clocks. They all run at slightly different frame rates. And man, people get pissed off because they're like, my monitor runs at 60 hertz. I want you to run the game at 60 hertz. And we say, well, I'm sorry, but the game didn't really run at 60 hertz. It ran at some off-read, and so you're going to get some off-beat scrolling. I'm sorry, but I'd rather be accurate than have perfect scrolling on your 60 hertz machine, because I'd rather have the timing of the game, which is more important to the gameplay, frankly, be more accurate. So, being able to analyze the hardware, being able to get it more and more right, those are all important things to me. I'd say a 5th goal, and I kind of put it at the bottom, but really, I'd like to see these games exist beyond the hardware lifespan. I mean, we know, people at the show know that these games it takes a lot of dedication to keep these games up and running. And my hats are off to all those people out there who keep these things up and running. I have a few games at home. I got a Turbo Mini and a Mappy, and those things are never working right. And every time I get it working right, the next time I power it on, something else screws up. And the fact that these guys bring them here and let them run, that's great. But there's only a handful of people in the world who are that dedicated, and it's getting smaller, and the hardware's getting harder to keep going. And really, I think the only long-term viable solution is to have something where you can emulate the platform and allow people to play Pac-Man in its original glory in the future, or Donkey Kong 2, or whatever comes along, So since this talk's supposed to be about what keeps you motivated and how do you stay motivated and that kind of thing, I'll say little tips at the bottom. So tip number 1 is define and understand your goals. So if you're going to work on a project, the first thing you want to do is really understand what's your project about. This is my attempt to really understand what my project's about. And I say preferably not fame or fortune. I think fame or fortune are great goals for work, I don't think it's a great goal for something you want to do for fun in your spare time. That's my opinion, but I think I find it pretty challenging. If there was an incentive about money, or if it was all about pleasing people, that's where it starts to get down the slippery slope. So what is MAME not? I think this is important to spell out too. It's not perfect. I'd love it to be, but I know more than anybody in this room probably just how many hacks and kludges are in the system and how much I'd really like it to be better. And so we try. We do the best we can. We're a limited resource. There's probably a dozen active developers right now. People are always trying to make it better, gain new knowledge. We just do the best we can. MAME is not consistent. There are 100 people working on it. So nobody has the same opinion. There's no central authority. I coordinate. I don't rule with an iron fist. Sometimes I wish I did, though. We're also not consistent through the years. We change our minds. I'm okay with that. I'm not a person who believes that if you change your mind on something, you're a weak person. Sometimes new information comes to light. Sometimes you think that was a dumb idea. Why did I do it that way? It's really okay. And it's not a means of playing free games. I don't believe that. And I know some people see it that way. And it's one of the big complaints I hear about MAME. I don't want it to be like that. We put roadblocks in the way of it being that way. People will do with it what they will. I can't entirely stop them, but we do our best to try and make sure that the purpose is clear for what we are. MAME is not a drop-in replacement for PCBs. So there are a lot of people who want to take an arcade cabinet, put a PC in it, and run MAME on it, and plug it into all their I/O and just have it work. That's a cool goal. I think that'd be kind of a cool offshoot project. That's not our project. Our project's not really about that. In part because I know there's a lot more to an arcade game than just how the games ran, but that's what our focus is. We decided that that's our focus early on, and so that's what it is. And it could be done, it could be taken in a different direction to expand beyond that, but we chose not to. We're also not a platform for enhancing the games. So a lot of people like to say, hey, make the graphics cooler or run some cool filter on it to angle all the graphics because you're running on high-res things. No, not really. That's not really our bag. Now, that said, we've made some attempts to try and make it look more like an arcade monitor on your LCD, and they're somewhat cheesy. They work pretty well in some cases, but again, that's more like we'd rather it look like it looks on an arcade monitor than it looks on your LCD. But we don't really want to make it look better than it originally did. The games are as they are. We want to present them as close to as they are as possible. So that's my tip number 2 is know your boundaries. And knowing what isn't your goals is really important. So if you don't really know what you're not supposed to do, then any suggestion that comes along, it's very easy to suck that into your goals. You say all of a sudden, oh, shoot, I should do that. Or shoot, I should do that. Be willing to put up boundaries to what you want to do because it's insidious. It gets into you. You're thinking, okay, I had this cool little project I was working on, and somebody made this suggestion. And I took it as my own. I made it my goal. I really want to do that. And now I'm kind of not enjoying working on the project anymore because I have to do this thing that I said I was going to do. I kind of fessed up to that. So back off from that. Try not to try to keep your boundaries solid on what you're doing if you're doing your own project. Complaints. Man, people are a bunch of whiners, aren't they? So I work on this project for free for many years. We give out the source code. Feel free to modify it or do stuff what you want. Feed it back in there. But we get a lot of complaints. I could go through all these. I have funny stories probably behind every one of them. I talked about some of these things already. Really, when you look at any of these and you put up our goals and what we're not doing, and you can kind of look at these, and most of these just fall out of that. You're saying, this doesn't match my goals. This isn't really what I'm doing. It's not what I'm here for. My goal is not to run the fastest. My goal is, I'd rather focus on accuracy. 3D hardware. That is actually a soft one because there's some interest in doing some 3D hardware. So I won't talk about that one too much. But fix existing games before adding new ones. A bunch of people work on this project for free, for fun. There's really nothing better than taking some ROM set that you've never seen before, some game that you've never heard of before, figuring out how it worked, and seeing it come to life on your screen. That is that's an awesome moment. And I don't blame anybody for wanting to do that and replicate that over and over again. And so, you know, if that's their prerogative. It's their project. It's free. Let them do what they want. You know, lots of people complain that there's a lot of porn games. Yeah, sorry. You know, we don't draw boundaries on what's in and out of MAME. If it's a video game, if it has a CPU and a video display, it's probably worth putting in MAME. I mean, you know, there's really not much beyond that. There's maybe a few other factors, but you know, it's fuzzy. But you know, I talked about documentation, open source. A lot of people have a sore spot for the fact that we're not open source, capital O, capital S, meaning GPL or BSD. It's because we have a license term that says don't use this commercially. Personally, I don't think that really buys us much. Other people disagree on the team. It's hard to get 100 people to agree on a license, so we kind of leave it the way it is. Yeah, most of the other things. So basically, stay firm to your goals. You hear all these complaints, and we hear a lot, but you know, you're starting on a new project and you tell somebody, and they say, oh, why don't you do it this way? And you know, stay firm to your goal. Make sure you remember what you're really in it for, why you're doing it for yourself, and keep doing it that way. So we're inconsistent, as I said before. You may or may not know, if you don't know the history of the project, we didn't support gambling-style games for personal reasons of Nicola, who started the project. We didn't support vector games for a long time. A lot of people thought, oh, vector games, they're very different from a raster game, so we shouldn't support them. I said there's still arcade games. Yeah, it's a different type of monitor. We can handle that. We changed our mind. It's okay. Laserdisc games. We've always wanted to support Laserdisc games. They're kind of a pain. There's lots of video issues that are making them kind of complicated, but we do want to support them. I mean, there are arcade games. It kind of falls in the purview there, so let's do that. At one point, we were licensed under GPL for a few versions early on. I think minds were changed early on in that. That's okay. We had a driver for Pong for a while. Pong is kind of unique in our description for what we actually do in MAME. We emulate games that have CPUs in them. Pong doesn't have a CPU. It's just all discrete logic. When you have a CPU, all the code that's running, you have CPUs. You can treat it as a black box. There's documents on how that work. You can run, and that CPU is the same in hundreds of different systems. So you can run all that code against that CPU, verify that it works exactly right. You can buy a CPU like that and verify any behaviors you don't know. CPUs are great because once all your code is running, that's running is CPU based, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of prove that you're right. With a game like Pong, we decided, you know, there's 140 odd components on Pong, or I don't know what the number is. And if we screw up one connection, or if the timing on one little thing is not right, it may look like it's working, but it's not going to work like the original thing. We have the barrier to entry to make that thing really, to give us confidence that that thing can really work just like the original, wasn't there. And so we kind of backed off on that. Now, there's been a couple of recent efforts to do some of the non-CPU games on other emulators that have some appeal, have some promise in terms of being a little more provable, a little more provable. So that may, who knows? I'm not going to predict the future of that one. We support artificial high score saving. A lot of games don't save high scores. My favorite game, Mappy, does not support saving high scores. So we used to have a hack where you could do that. It turns out that affects the way games play. So we said, well, that kind of gets in the way of game playing, and that's unfortunate because I think a lot of people who want to play the games want to keep their high scores. And well, there's pen and paper that works. I'm sorry. The original game didn't keep it when you powered it off, so you know. And there's other versions of MAME that are out there that do put that stuff back in, but the official version, we want to keep that stuff out as much as possible. We used to have a policy where we had some drivers that were sort of test drivers, and we didn't really want people to use them, but they were there in the source code, and we eventually decided that was kind of a silly idea, so everything's there, you can do it. So I say stay close to your goals, but don't stay firm to your goals, but don't be too firm. Be willing to change. It makes sense to change your mind. Again, do it based on what you want to do. It's your project. Never lose sight of the fact that it's something that you're working on. So, and then there's people who just hate it. Oh man. So for a long time we were the Borg of emulators. Every other emulator out there, we were just sucking them up. We were doing every game there. Now our purview from the beginning was any arcade game is fair game. So you know, I didn't really care that there was another emulator that did it. I Borged some emulators. I take the blame for that. You know, I like those midway games and stuff. That's fine. But you know, some people never let that down. Like, they feel like we killed it. And the problem with the real reason why most other emulators didn't exist is because they had a very narrow focus. They got the games they wanted to work running, and then they were done. What's more to do? The problem is, then your code rots because you're not doing anything on it. You're done. And so, do you keep it up to date? Do you keep it moving? Is there interest in your thing anymore because there's nothing new coming out of it? No. I think the reason why MAME kind of works in this environment is because we're never going to be done. And so, there's always something new. There's always something to keep interest. Always something to complain about. You know, it just kind of keeps things lively. And so, you know, that just kind of works out for us. People complain about our goals. I think we're pompous egomaniacs. I like to think I'm not that pompous, but maybe I am. We make stupid decisions. You can question it. But realize that there's people out there who are going to hate you no matter what. I mean, you could be doing the most amazing project, saving mankind, and there'll be somebody out there who has some bile for you out on the internet. Especially on the internet. Oh my God. And IRC, stay away, far away, especially if you like emulation, because IRC is sort of the cesspool of vitriol in the internet, as far as I'm concerned. So I stay far away from that stuff, and I find that if you ignore it and just say, "Hey, you know, whatever, people are just going to hate me," don't let that get under your skin, because I think in the end, any project, you know, I'm sure. The Donkey Kong 2 project has its haters, people who think that he did a horrible thing. And I think it's really cool. A lot of people here probably think it's pretty cool. But, you know, there are some people out there who probably send him hate mail and stuff. And so, you know, every project has it. So, especially the more you get known. If you're just doing it on your own and nobody knows about you, yeah, they're not going to hate you. But once you start letting people know, then people will hate you. So, just ignore them. But they exist. You're not going to defeat them. You're not going to convince them. So, just ignore them. So MAME's not our job. I take MAME very seriously, like for the last 11 years on this project. But it's my spare time, and that's how I choose to do it. Wonder I'm still married. Real life does take priority, though, mostly. Yeah, some people make the wrong choice, but that's okay. There's a temptation when people complain and they say, you could do this better, you should do this different, to say, yeah, okay, that's cool. If I did this thing, they'd be really happy. Or if this thing worked better, I'd make, you know, tons of people happy. That's tempting. Ooh, making people happy, because then you have less people complaining, right? Not so much. On the whole, it doesn't really take away from the complaining. And then you're not working for yourself anymore. You're doing it to make people happy. And that can kill the fun. I mean, I'm not saying it's not fun to make people happy, but I'm just saying if that becomes your overriding goal, then you're not doing it for you anymore. You're doing it for somebody else. So, and MAME's never dealt with money. I don't want to be involved in that stuff. That's just, I don't know. Too many expectations to set. Too many potential ways things could go sour. So I don't even want to know about it. So. My recommendation is ignore fame and fortune. If you're really doing a project for yourself, do it for yourself, and don't worry what comes out of it. Something may come out of it afterwards or as a sideline or whatever, and you may become your job. That's great. Then it's your job. Admit it, that's your job, and it's not your fun little project that it used to be. But I haven't gotten that point yet either, so it's still a little fun little project for me. So, in the end, why do I love working on it? It's a huge project. As I said, I know there are 3,000 plus supported games in it, and I know that 2,900 of them have problems. There's always more to do. We could do it better. We try to do the best we can with what we've got, with what we know. Taking time to do measurements on PCBs to actually figure out what the actual frame rates are and what clocks are, and to see what little subtle behaviors happen, and to make it so that people can write new code on the platforms and have it run just the first time on the real hardware when they put it. That'd be really cool if we could get to that point. And to me, then you've really done it right. And it becomes important when you look at stuff like, what is the Miss Pac-Man's or the Pac-Man's kill screen? To get that to look right, you have to make sure that when you read a memory location that's not mapped, that you do the right thing. Because if you don't, then you don't get exactly the right behavior, and the tunnels show up in different spots, and you're not getting the right kill screen behavior. So You know, I think we get a lot of that stuff right because it's known. It's more the stuff that's unknown, or when new people try to do stuff, then we don't necessarily get that right, and that can always be better. And some people get more attention than others, and some drivers get more attention than others. But the other reason I love working on MAME, as I said, nothing beats seeing something coming up and running for the first time. You're like, wow, so that's how it worked. You know, I put it all together. I grabbed the PCA from here, and the sound chip from here, and the CPU from here, and I took some code. I just ran it, and it worked. That's awesome. I love to see how things work. So, you know, there's always something new to find out. I love the fact that I learned to read schematics as a result of this, and that I can, you know, now take a digital circuit and pretty much figure out how it all works, and I find some cool things, like just how neat the Galaxian hardware was, and like, you know, why it was abused and replicated billions of times for all kinds of different games, because it really is fairly elegantly designed, very simple, low chip count hardware. Another reason I love it is my software engineering challenge of, like, you know, make a universal emulation system. That's what I'd like to do. I'd like to make MAME more universal. There's a sister project to MAME called MES, which is for consoles and computers. It's not as well, people don't know about it as much. There's not as much active development. There's like just a few guys. But they can leverage all the stuff that we do in MAME. And that's a good and bad thing. On the good side, they get all the work that we do, and on the bad side, every time I make some global system-wide change, they have to spend weeks catching up and fixing everything. So that's got its good and bad sides, but you know, they have some really good systems in there. They have, you know, very good Atari 2600 emulation. They have good solid, you know, Nintendo emulation and various other computer systems. And they have a lot of really weird systems. Like there's some guy in Poland or somewhere is adding all these like Eastern European computer systems you've never heard of before. But like, you know, eventually we were able to emulate the system that like ran the original Tetris, you know, back in Russia or something. You know, it's like there's some cool stuff that you can come out of that thing. So just being able to constantly like say, hey, this is really cool stuff. These guys have the same kind of flavor we do. I like to cooperate with them. I'd like to make the central core of MAME even more usable for both projects. And for any other projects, frankly, that come along that want to base off of something that's really rich. There's a lot of work into it. I love to know that my work has helped others. So I know that people, you know, have used MAME to figure out, oh, I've got bad boards. I know people have used MAME to figure out, oh, my hard drive died on my game, and I was able to recreate it and rebuild it based on the information that we had in MAME. I know that people have debugged problems. There's a guy who's gone through and figured out all the kill screens in some of the famous games using the debugger, and has like posted articles about why the bug exists and why when Donkey Kong gets to a certain screen it dies, and here's a patch to fix it so you could actually like play past that screen if you really wanted to. People are kind of nuts like me, and you know, in the end I freaking love the arcade. I mean, consoles are okay, but arcade games, I don't know. I love to come here. I love the smell of the old wood in the arcade machines. I love to, you know, see the bright black and white vector games and the Laserdisc games. You know, I love that stuff. I want that stuff to live on. And I want to know how it works. And I want, you know, I just love the arcade. So really, in the end, I'm just going to say, do it for you first. Make sure that you're benefiting from what you do. And so whenever I get hate mail or whenever people tell me I'm doing stuff wrong, I look back and say, am I really doing it wrong? Well, maybe it's their opinion, but for what I really want to do, I think I'm doing what I really want to do, and that's why I keep working on it. So, you know, this is my summary, my path to enlightenment. Those are all the tips I had. So if you're working on a project on your own, I recommend, you know, keeping focus on what you really want to do and just do it for you and ignore everybody else, because really it's all about you, and don't let money or thoughts of fame get in the way. So I think that's yay. I don't know how much time we have, probably close to 0. So if you have a couple...
started late, hopefully people can be patient. I think there are a lot of questions.
I think take a couple of questions if people want. So start there.
You covered sort of the good and the bad side of source code as documentation.
Yeah.
Suppose that someone wanted to write a specific emulator, for say a 6502 or something, in another language, and wanted to use MAME, which is obviously a reasonably good 6502 emulator, as sort of a reference.
Mm-hmm.
and I hope this isn't offline, a terribly complicated offline question. Where in the MAME source would you say to go first?
Well, there's a directory called CPU,
Okay.
and there's a directory under that called M6502. That's where you want to look. But anyway, the question was if people wanted to write, use MAME as a reference, which is exactly what it's there for. So I've gotten questions saying, can I look at your code and do this? And I can understand that because some companies are super paranoid about like GPL, virility or whatever that word is, and all that other good stuff. Yes, absolutely look at the code. MAME's license is essentially BSD, so there's no piracy thing about it. Like, as long as you look at it and say, okay, this is how it works, you can write your own code, that's fine. Frankly, I wish that I could, for my code personally, I'd like to say, yeah, everybody use the code because I don't really care. But there are some folks, of the 100 developers, who really get under their skin if somebody else is using their code without, because they put all that work in for free. So for that reason, we sort of have the rule about it. But if you want to look, the source code is pretty well organized, and all the CPU emulators, there's probably 50 plus CPUs that we emulate, and a lot of them are really battle hardened and well tested. So it's a great place to start if you want to do a CPU emulator, because that's one of the hardest things is you'll get it 99% right. There'll be some subtle behavior that is really hard to reproduce. And take another question in the back.
I wanted to say two things. One is I want to say thanks for doing what you're doing. And my question is, how much time do you think the other MAME developers actually spend playing the games that you emulate?
I don't know I can't speak for anybody else. It's sad in a way because I put so much work into this thing and I never play it. I mean, yeah, sure, I'll play a round of this or that to see if something's working or whatever, but for me the challenge and the interest is how did it work? Can I make it work better? And what don't I know about this thing? I find that interesting probably more than playing the game, so I'm a little bit of freaky that way. I do have a couple of cabinets at home. They kind of can occasionally come on when they work. I have put a MAME computer in a cabinet just for fun because it seems like a cool thing to do. I've turned it on a couple times. It's kind of unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes. I do love the games. I grew up playing them, but I've never really been that good of a game player. I've never been that hardcore of a game player. I've actually been more. I always wanted to be the guy in his garage who wrote, like the one guy in his garage who wrote games, or two guys who wrote games. And when I got to the software industry in '95, finally, it was already like you had to be a team of 40 people to make games, and now you have to be a team of like 300 people to make games, and it doesn't interest me in the slightest. So, unfortunately. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering when you add a game to the emulator, one that hasn't been emulated until now. Can you tell us kind of at a high level, what is that process? Where do you start? What are the steps you go through?
Well, it depends on how you got the game. So sometimes you'll have some guy out there saying, hey, I got this random board in a junk pile, and there's a bunch of ROMs on it, and I dump them, and they don't match anything that's in the database in name. So figure out what it is. So we go and we say, okay, what's in the ROM? So a lot of it's, can you find the code? You want to find some code in there. If there's no code in the ROMs, and you can tell by the patterns, you get used to looking at patterns. You can say, oh, this is graphics data, this is sound data, you know what that looks like. You know what code data looks like, it's kind of randomy, it's got some text in it. You start with that, and then you say, okay, well, what kind of CPU is it? You always start with the CPU. Once you have the CPU, you start running the code and looking at it line by line and say, okay, what's the code trying to do? And a lot of times it's trying to reach out to all the I/O devices. So there's some sound chips it's trying to talk to, and some video hardware it's trying to talk to, and some RAM it needs. And there's some basic stuff that every CPU needs, and so you kind of start to fill that in piece by piece. And then you build it up from there. And a lot of the early emulation worked that way because nobody knew how to read schematics, nobody knew how to, they existed, there weren't as good archives. Like there's these awesome people who go out there and collect all the manuals and make PDFs of them and put them up. Those guys rock, and you guys should be appreciative for that because, like, even as a cabinet owner, being able to grab the turbo manual and the PDF file and figuring out why this board isn't working is great. But it's also great because a lot of the early games, especially, had schematics for them. Schematics enable much more perfect emulation because for people who can read them, you can figure out, well, what happens when I do read a memory location that doesn't exist, and you can make it so that when you run your new Donkey Kong levels that they behave the way they did on the arcade because we understand how the hardware works. And so I think if I have schematics for something, that's a whole new ball of wax. I can sit down and just kind of say, okay, I can analyze the circuit and see how it does it. But if you're just starting from the ROMs, a lot of times it's just find the CPU, see what it does, start to flesh out. You can imagine what a game does. You know, it draws stuff to the screen, there's some RAM behind the screen, it talks to some sound chips and patterns. You know, there's certain things that you just kind of learn to do, and it's more through experimentation and understanding how games work to kind of get to that point.
How far down ultimately are you interested in emulating? I mean, I keep hearing things about people who have cabinets that aren't stored in the right place or whatever, and some of these, the chips aren't seeded well, and they develop very interesting characteristics as a result. How much of that are you actually interested in doing, or is it enough at the end of the day to just go, well, the game runs?
Well, obviously you want to focus on what works. It is possible today to simulate RAM errors, simple RAM errors. Through the cheat engine or the debugger, that's certainly possible to do. There are, we haven't really strived to do that, but through some of the mechanisms that exist today, we can simulate some behaviors. We can simulate burn-in. You can make a nice overlay and make some burn-in on your monitor if you like that kind of thing. Actually, I've always one of my features that I've on my back burner is to make a burn-in generator that'll generate a piece of artwork that looks like burn-in, so you can put it on top of another game and see like Centipede behind your Pac-Man or whatever. I think that's only possible to do. There's other things that you can do. I recently, but every time you do that, you're adding complexity that takes away a little bit from focusing, because as a documentation project, you really want to focus on how does it work, not so much how can it fail. But how can it fail is a useful thing for those who are trying to solve their problems, and so I recognize that. And so, it's kind of a trade-off, but we haven't really put much effort into trying to look at how a lot of things fail beyond being able to simulate occasional ROM failures or whatever. I mean, you can go today and say, you can go whack a byte in a ROM and see if you get a bad checksum and see if it matches the bad checksum that you get on your board to see which one's bad. Or you can dump all the ROMs on your board and compare them against the database and MAME to see what's there and what's not there. So those are both ways that I think that we can do that. ROMs are easy, RAMs are a little easy. Some of the weird behaviors not so easy. I think we've got enough work to do, frankly. So I haven't put much time in that. Want to take one more, I think, before we go, Ken? Okay. One more.
What's your opinion about MAME cabinets being sold on the internet and eBay?
I'm fine with them being sold if they don't include MAME or illegal material. Frankly, a lot of these guys play fast and loose, and that's unfortunate. It's a touchy issue because I'd love to be able to go and talk to all the game companies and have them provide a way for everybody to just buy the ROMs. Realistically, that's never going to happen because A, finding out who owns what is very hard. That's not really a good excuse. B, when you do find out who who owns it, they don't care. They don't want to. I mean, to them, what could they possibly make off of it? A few dollars. It's not important to their bottom line to do it, to really do it. And so there are a few companies that really will go after the people who sell their games on that, as they should. I think I like to keep this a hobbyist project, and that's one of the reasons I often get offers. Here, let me advertise for you. Let me help you reach more people. I'm not really that interested in that, thank you. That's why it's developer focused. That's why we don't put much effort in the user interface. That's why, it can do these things. And I think for people who want to put the effort into it and treat it as a hobby and who really want to, really care enough to do it, that's probably fine, and they're probably going to, get away with it because an individual, doing some things isn't going to really upset a company. What's going to upset a company is if a lot of people go out and they sell these cabinets, they put a bunch of illegal material on there, and then it all comes back and say, well, they all point to MAME and say, well, it's because of MAME. That's what I want to avoid, and that's why, we've gone up and down in terms of how aggressive we are about yelling at people who are like on eBay and that sort of thing, selling cabinets with the games. Sell the cabinet, fine. Let people put the stuff in there. But people want to sell turnkey solutions because that's what a user who's not into the whole thing, they do that. But you know what? The user who wants the turnkey solution can probably buy some of the licensed stuff and he'd be perfectly happy. He'd buy the Midway cabinets that they've put out, and they've put out OBT cabinet and some other things. that'd probably be totally fine for them. He's not really that into it. I think the person who's really into it is going to put the effort in, and if they want to use MAME for that, it's in their own privacy of their own home. Don't make money off of it. Just if you're doing it because you love it and for your own use, that's fine. Don't sell it. And I've worked out with a lot of the big cabinet guys to tell them not to do that. I think in the end that's good. One of the reasons, if you know MAME's history, we got into a little bit of a issue with owning the trademark MAME. Another company tried to trademark MAME and use it to batter people on for legal reasons. And we took that back and said, hey, look, we'll do it. Point out cases that you feel are infringing. We'll help you kind of try and do what we can to do it. So it's a limited effort. Again, it takes away from the fun of the project because it's not really what you want to be doing. On the other hand, it's sort of a necessary evil to keep doing what we're doing because I really want to protect what we do. I think what we do is important. I don't want it to be frowned upon by people who could really benefit from it. People. I think our companies should appreciate, hopefully, that if they want to do an emulation of a game, they got a good example of how to make it work. They don't have to keep all that stuff themselves and figure it out and dig up all their old archives. And so. I don't know. That's just kind of how I feel. It's an issue. I know that a lot of people have different opinions about how good or bad that whole thing is, but just don't make money off that stuff. That's really important. I think that's it. I think I'll leave you guys to the next person.